The barn was already half consumed by flames when Knox Hawthorne kicked open the door to find the horses still trapped inside. Their screams tearing through the smoke filled air like knives through his chest. It was August of 1882 in Wickenburg, Arizona, and the summer heat had turned everything tinder dry, making the fire spread faster than any man could outrun. Knox did not think about his own safety as he plunged into that inferno. He only thought about saving those animals, about doing what was right even when fear clawed at his throat. The smoke filled his lungs immediately, thick and black and suffocating, but he pushed forward, releasing each horse from its stall, driving them toward the opening where the orange glow of freedom beckoned. He got 4 horses out before the roof beam cracked above him with a sound like thunder, and burning wood crashed down, blocking his escape. Knox threw himself toward the last narrow opening, breathing in lungfuls of that poisonous smoke, feeling it sear down his throat like he had swallowed fire itself. He made it out alive, collapsing in the dirt as the barn collapsed behind him, but something inside him had been destroyed. When he tried to speak, to tell the ranch hands he was all right, nothing came out except a strangled, painful rasp that died in his ruined throat. The doctor in Wickenburg examined Knox 3 days later, peering down his throat with instruments that made Knox gag and his eyes water. The physician shook his head slowly, his expression grave beneath his graying mustache. "The smoke damage is severe," he said, addressing Knox's older brother Silas, who stood nearby with his hat crushed between his hands. "The vocal cords are badly scarred. He may never speak again, or if he does, it will be nothing more than a whisper. I am sorry." Knox sat on the examination table, his hands gripping the edge so hard his knuckles turned white. He was 24 years old, a ranch hand who had always been known for his quick wit and easy conversation. Now he was reduced to silence, locked inside himself, unable to voice his thoughts or feelings. The frustration that welled up inside him was almost worse than the physical pain that still radiated through his damaged throat. Silas tried to be encouraging as they walked back to the small house they shared on the edge of the Copper Ridge Ranch where they both worked. "You are still the best horseman in the territory," Silas said, clapping Knox on the shoulder. "You do not need words for that. The horses understand you better than most people anyway." Knox appreciated his brother's attempt at comfort, but it did nothing to ease the hollow ache spreading through his chest. How could he court a woman now? How could he make friends, tell stories around a campfire, or simply share a joke with the other ranch hands? His entire life had been built on connection, on the easy camaraderie that came from working alongside good men and sharing words over whiskey at the end of a long day. All of that was gone now, stolen by smoke and flames. The ranch owner, a fair man named Theodore Copper, told Knox his job was secure for as long as he wanted it. "You proved your character when you saved those horses," Theodore said, looking Knox straight in the eye. "A man like that has a place on my ranch, voice or no voice." Knox nodded his gratitude, managing a painful whisper of thank you that made Theodore wince at the sound. But gratitude did not erase reality. The other ranch hands did not know how to act around him anymore. Conversations died when he approached. They would nod at him, offer half smiles, then turn back to their discussions, leaving Knox standing at the periphery of a life he could no longer fully participate in. He learned to communicate through gestures, through nods and shakes of his head, through written notes when absolutely necessary, but it was exhausting and isolating. By September, Knox had retreated into himself, speaking to almost no one except through the bare minimum of necessary communication. That was when Emmeline Abbott arrived in Wickenburg. She came on the afternoon stagecoach, stepping down onto the dusty main street with a single worn carpetbag, and an expression of determined hope that caught Knox's attention even from across the street, where he was loading supplies onto a wagon. Emmeline was perhaps 21 or 22, with dark auburn hair pinned up beneath a simple bonnet, and a dress that had been mended several times but was clean and pressed. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were too strong, her jaw too determined, her eyes too direct, but there was something compelling about her that made Knox pause in his work to watch as she looked up and down the street, clearly searching for something. She found it in the form of a hand-painted sign hanging above a small building near the edge of town. Wickenburg school teacher wanted. Emmeline squared her shoulders and walked toward it with the purposeful stride of a woman who had traveled a long way and was not about to be discouraged now. Knox watched her disappear inside, then returned to his loading, thinking nothing more of the newcomer except that she had a certain quality of resilience about her that he could not help but admire. It was 2 weeks before he saw her again. Knox had ridden into town to pick up a special order of tack for the ranch, and he was tying his horse outside the general store when he heard a commotion from the alley beside the building. A group of men drifters by the look of them, not locals, had cornered someone against the wall. Knox heard a woman's voice, clear and unafraid despite the obvious threat. "I said no. I am not interested in your company. Please step aside." Knox moved without thinking, his boots hitting the hard, packed earth as he rounded the corner of the building. There were 3 of them, rough-looking men who smelled of whiskey even from several feet away, and they had the auburn-haired woman from the stagecoach pressed against the wall. She held her chin high, her carpetbag clutched in one hand like a weapon, but Knox could see the fear she was trying to hide behind her brave words. He did not hesitate. Knox grabbed the nearest man by the shoulder and spun him around. The drifter took one look at Knox's size. He was tall and broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, and his expression shifted from surprise to aggression. "This is not your concern, friend," the man said, his words slurring slightly. Knox did not bother trying to respond verbally. Instead, he positioned himself between Emmeline and the 3 men, his stance wide and unmistakably protective. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, not drawing it but making its presence known. The second man laughed. "What, you do not talk? You some kind of mute?" Knox kept his eyes fixed on the leader, the one who had spoken first. He could feel Emmeline behind him, her rapid breathing audible in the sudden tension of the alley. The leader studied Knox for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Knox let him see the absolute resolve in his expression, the promise that if they pushed this, he would not back down regardless of the odds. Finally, the leader spat in the dirt and jerked his head toward his companions. "Not worth it," he muttered. "Come on." The 3 men filed past Knox, shooting him dark looks that promised this was not forgotten, but they left the alley and headed toward the saloon down the street. Knox waited until they were well gone before turning to face Emmeline. She was staring at him with an expression of mingled relief and curiosity. "Thank you," she said simply. "I am Emmeline Abbott. I just started teaching at the school here." Knox nodded, touching the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. He wanted to introduce himself properly, to ask if she was all right, to say all the things a gentleman should say, but the words were locked behind the scarred ruins of his voice. Instead, he could only stand there, feeling increasingly awkward as the silence stretched between them. Emmeline tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You are welcome to tell me your name," she said gently, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Knox felt heat rise in his face. He gestured toward his throat and shook his head, trying to communicate the problem. Understanding dawned in Emmeline's eyes, followed quickly by compassion but not pity, Knox noted with surprise. Most people looked at him with pity once they understood. Emmeline just looked thoughtful. "You cannot speak?" she asked. Knox nodded. "But you can hear perfectly well." Another nod. "Can you write?" Knox hesitated, then made a so-so gesture with his hand. He could write, but not well. He had never had much schooling, and his letters were blocky and childish. Emmeline seemed to consider this for a moment. "Well, then we shall simply have to find another way to communicate," she said matter-of-factly. "Actions speak louder than words anyway, or so I have been told. You have certainly proved that true today. Will you walk me back to the schoolhouse? I confess, I would feel safer with your company after that unpleasant encounter." Knox offered his arm, and Emmeline took it without hesitation. As they walked back through town, she talked easily, not seeming to require responses from him. She told him about her journey from Missouri, about how she had left her family's farm after her parents died within months of each other from illness, about how teaching was the only respectable profession available to an unmarried woman with some education and no money. "I know Wickenburg is rough," she said as they approached the small schoolhouse, a simple wooden structure with a bell tower. "But it is a new start, and I intend to make the most of it." When they reached the school steps, Emmeline turned to face Knox fully. "I still do not know your name," she said. Knox fumbled in his pocket for the stub of a pencil he carried and, finding no paper, held out his palm helplessly. Emmeline laughed, a bright sound that made something in Knox's chest tighten. She pulled a small notebook from her bag and offered it to him along with a proper pencil. Knox wrote carefully, his letters uneven. "Knox Hawthorne." "Knox," Emmeline said, and he liked the way his name sounded in her voice. "Thank you again, Knox. I hope we shall meet again soon." She extended her hand for a handshake, which surprised Knox. Most women would not be so forward, but he took it, feeling the strength in her slim fingers. Then she turned and climbed the steps into the schoolhouse, leaving Knox standing in the street with a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through him. Over the following weeks, Knox found excuses to ride into Wickenburg more often than strictly necessary. He would time his errands to coincide with the end of the school day, when Emmeline dismissed her students, mostly minors' children and a few from the nearby ranches. He would watch from a distance as she stood on the school steps, making sure each child got safely on their way home. Sometimes she would catch sight of him and wave, and Knox would touch his hat brim in return before riding off, feeling simultaneously foolish and content. It was Theodore Copper's wife, Margaret, who finally pushed things forward. She had heard about the incident in the alley. News traveled fast in a small town, and she invited Emmeline to dinner at the ranch house one Sunday in late September. When Emmeline arrived, Knox was there too, having been included in the invitation without warning. Margaret was not subtle in her matchmaking attempts, seating Knox and Emmeline beside each other at the table and steering the conversation in ways that allowed Emmeline to do most of the talking while Knox could simply listen and respond with occasional nods or gestures. "Knox saved 4 horses from that barn fire," Margaret said at one point, her eyes twinkling as she watched Emmeline's reaction. "Nearly died doing it. That is how he lost his voice from the smoke." Emmeline turned to look at Knox with new understanding. "That must have been terrifying," she said softly, "and incredibly brave." Knox felt his face heat up again. He made a dismissive gesture, trying to indicate it was nothing special, but Emmeline shook her head. "Do not diminish it," she said firmly. "Courage is courage, whether you want credit for it or not." After dinner, Margaret suggested that Knox show Emmeline around the ranch. "The sunset view from the east pasture is lovely this time of year," she said with all the subtlety of a hammer. Emmeline accepted graciously, and Knox found himself walking beside her through the golden evening light, the Arizona sky turning shades of orange and pink that rivaled anything he had ever seen. They walked in silence for a while, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that did not need filling. Finally, Emmeline spoke. "I imagine it must be very frustrating," she said quietly, "not being able to say what you are thinking." Knox nodded, appreciating that she understood. "May I ask you questions?" You could nod yes or shake your head no. It is not perfect, but it is a start. Knox smiled, something he had not done much of since the fire, and nodded enthusiastically. Emmeline returned the smile. "Good. Are you happy working on this ranch?" "Yes." "Do you have family in Wickenburg?" "Yes, his brother." "Are you close with your brother?" "Yes." "Do you enjoy these Sunday dinners, or did Margaret trap you into this?" Knox laughed, a silent shake of his shoulders, and made a gesture that indicated Margaret had indeed trapped him, but he did not mind. Emmeline laughed too, and the sound was better than any music Knox had ever heard. They talked, or rather, Emmeline talked and Knox responded until the sun had fully set, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Emmeline told him about her students, about the challenges of teaching children whose parents needed them working rather than learning, about her small room above the general store where she lived. "It is lonely sometimes," she admitted. "I have not made many friends here yet. The other women in town are pleasant enough, but they all have their own families and concerns. I think they see me as temporary, someone who will leave as soon as a better opportunity comes along." Knox shook his head firmly and pointed at her, then at the ground, trying to convey that she belonged here. Emmeline studied his face, and something in her expression softened. "You think I should stay?" she asked. Knox nodded. "Why?" It was a simple question, but a complicated answer. Knox struggled for a moment, then placed his hand over his heart and gestured around them at the ranch, at the town in the distance, at the wide open sky. He was trying to say that this place had room for her, that it needed people like her, that he wanted her to stay. He did not know if she understood all of that, but she seemed to grasp at least part of it. "I think I would like to stay," Emmeline said thoughtfully. "If I can make a life here, if I can find reasons to stay." She looked at Knox as she said this last part, and the meaning in her eyes made his heart beat faster. They walked back to the ranch house together, and when Knox helped her into the wagon for the ride back to town, his hand lingered on hers just a moment longer than necessary. Emmeline did not pull away. After that evening, their friendship deepened rapidly. Knox began visiting the schoolhouse regularly, helping with repairs and maintenance that the town's limited budget could not cover. He fixed broken windows, reinforced the steps, and built new shelves for the small collection of books Emmeline was slowly accumulating through donations. They developed their own language during these visits, a complex system of gestures, expressions, and written notes that allowed them to communicate with increasing ease and nuance. Emmeline proved remarkably adept at reading Knox's face and body language. She learned that, when he rubbed the back of his neck, he was uncertain or embarrassed. When he tilted his head slightly to the left, he was amused. When his eyes went distant and sad, he was thinking about the life he had lost. She learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression that indicated everything from agreement to concern to affection. For his part, Knox found that being understood without words created an intimacy he had never experienced before. Emmeline truly saw him in a way that went deeper than surface conversation ever had. By October, Knox was spending almost every evening at the schoolhouse after Emmeline dismissed her students. He would arrive with his tools and some project to work on, and Emmeline would grade papers or prepare lessons while they enjoyed each other's company. Sometimes she would read aloud to him from books she loved, And Knox would sit and listen, watching the way her face animated as she brought the stories to life. Other times they would sit on the school steps and watch the sun set, communicating in their wordless language about everything and nothing. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Emmeline first touched on the subject that had been growing between them, unspoken but undeniable. "Knox," she said softly, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to really hear me." He turned to face her fully, giving her his complete attention. "I am falling in love with you," she said, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. "I know that might seem impossible. We have only known each other a few months, and we do not even speak in the conventional sense. But I have never felt more understood, more seen, more valued than I do when I am with you. The way you look at me makes me feel like I am the only person in the world. The way you listen, truly listen, makes me feel heard in a way I never have before. I do not need words from you, Knox. I need what you have already given me. Your time, your attention, your care." Knox felt like he could not breathe. No one had ever said anything like this to him, not even before the fire. He wanted desperately to respond, to tell her that he felt the same way, that she had become the center of his world, that every moment away from her felt like wasted time. But the words would not come, could not come. Instead, he did the only thing he could do. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and cupped her face gently in his calloused hands. He looked into her eyes, pouring everything he felt into that gaze, hoping she could read what he was trying to say. Then he leaned forward and kissed her, soft and careful and full of all the words he could not speak. When they broke apart, Emmeline was smiling through tears. "I understand," she whispered. "I understand everything you are telling me." Knox pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on top of her head, feeling more complete than he had since before the fire destroyed his voice. They sat like that until full dark, wrapped in each other's arms, needing no words to communicate what mattered most. Their courtship became the talk of Wickenburg. Some people thought it was romantic, the silent cowboy and the schoolteacher who had learned to read his heart. Others were more skeptical, questioning how a marriage could work when one partner could not speak. Knox's brother Silas was firmly in the romantic camp. "I have never seen you happier," he told Knox one evening as they worked together in the ranch stable. "Not even before the fire. She is good for you. Hell, she is good to you, and that is what matters. Anyone who cannot see that is a fool." The skeptics included Emmeline's landlord, Mrs. Harriet Porter, who ran the general store. She cornered Emmeline one afternoon in late October with concerns she clearly felt were motherly. "I do not doubt that Mr. Hawthorne is a good man, Mrs. Porter said, her voice pitched low so other customers would not hear. "But have you thought about the practicalities, dear? How will he provide for you? How will he communicate with your children? How will he tell you he loves you?" Emmeline met the older woman's eyes steadily. "He provides for me now, Mrs. Porter, in all the ways that matter. He shows me every day through his actions that he cares for me. As for children, they will learn to communicate with their father the same way I have, by paying attention, by being present, by understanding that love is not just about words. And as for telling me he loves me," Emmeline's expression softened into a private smile. "He tells me constantly. You just have to know how to listen." Knox proposed on a cool November evening as the first hints of winter began to touch the Arizona desert. He had been planning it for weeks, working in secret on a special project in the ranch workshop. When he invited Emmeline for a ride one Saturday afternoon, she accepted eagerly, bundling up against the chill and mounting the gentle mare Knox had saddled for her. They rode out to a spot Knox had discovered months ago, a small canyon with red rock walls that glowed like fire in the late afternoon sun. Knox had prepared the site earlier that day, spreading blankets on the ground and arranging a simple picnic. But the centerpiece was what he had built, a wooden box, intricately carved with images of a schoolhouse, a barn, horses, and two figures standing together under a wide sky. Inside the box was a simple gold ring, nothing fancy, but the best he could afford on a ranch hand's wages, and a letter. Knox had spent weeks on that letter, laboring over every word with a determination that made his hand cramp and his eyes ache. His spelling was imperfect and his handwriting rough, but every word came from his heart. Emmeline sat on the blanket and opened the box, gasping when she saw the ring. Then she lifted out the letter with trembling hands and began to read aloud. "Dear Emmeline, I cannot say these words out loud, so I must write them. Before I met you, I thought my life was over. I thought losing my voice meant losing everything that mattered, but you showed me that I was wrong. You taught me that being heard is not about making noise. You taught me that love is about seeing someone truly and being seen in return. You have given me back my life not by restoring my voice, but by showing me that I never needed it to be whole. With you, I am more myself than I ever was before. I cannot promise you fancy words or love songs. I cannot promise you poetry or sweet whispers, but I can promise you every day of my life. I can promise you my loyalty and my strength and my heart. I can promise you that I will work every day to make you happy, to make you feel cherished, to make you know that you are the best thing that ever happened to me. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend my life showing you what I cannot say? Yours always, Knox." By the time Emmeline finished reading, tears were streaming down her face. She looked up at Knox, who was watching her with an expression of naked hope and fear. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, absolutely yes." Knox let out a breath he had not realized he was holding and reached for her, pulling her into his arms. She was laughing and crying at the same time, and Knox was grinning so wide his face hurt. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Thank God, and then they were kissing, the carved box forgotten on the blanket beside them. They were married in December, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Wickenburg. Margaret Copper insisted on hosting the reception at the ranch, and half the town turned out to celebrate. Knox wore his best clothes, which were not fancy but were clean and pressed, and Emmeline wore a simple white dress that Margaret had helped her make. Silas stood up as Knox's best man, and one of Emmeline's students' mothers served as her matron of honor. The ceremony itself was unconventional. When the minister reached the part where Knox was supposed to say, "I do," there was a moment of awkward silence. Then Emmeline turned to face Knox fully and said, "Everyone here knows that Knox cannot speak, but I can speak for him. Knox, do you take me to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward?" Knox nodded firmly, his eyes locked on hers. "For better or for worse?" Another nod. "For richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part?" Knox took both her hands in his and nodded one more time, the gesture so emphatic that several people in the congregation laughed softly. The minister, a practical man who had agreed to the unusual arrangement beforehand, smiled and pronounced them married. Knox and Emmeline moved into a small house on the edge of the Copper Ridge Ranch property. It was not much, 2 rooms and a kitchen, with a well in the yard and a small barn for the 2 horses Knox owned, but it was theirs. Emmeline continued teaching at the school, and Knox continued working for Theodore Copper, but now they came home to each other every evening. They fell into an easy rhythm, learning the daily dances of married life, navigating small disagreements and large joys with their unique form of communication. Their first real fight came in January, over something that seemed small but touched on deeper issues. Emmeline had stayed late at school to help a struggling student, and she had not sent word to Knox about where she was. When she finally arrived home well after dark, Knox was pacing the small house, his expression thunderous with worry and anger. Emmeline immediately apologized, but Knox was too upset to accept it gracefully. He gestured sharply, his movements jerky with frustration, trying to convey his fear that something had happened to her. "I am sorry," Emmeline said again, "but Knox, I am not a child who needs constant supervision. I was safe at the school the entire time." Knox shook his head hard, pointing at the dark window. He was trying to say that she was alone in town after dark, that anything could have happened, that he had been imagining her hurt or worse. But without words, his message came across as controlling, as if he were saying she needed his permission to stay late at work. Emmeline's expression shifted from apologetic to defensive. "You do not get to tell me when I can and cannot work," she said, her voice rising. "I know you were worried, but your worry does not give you the right to dictate my choices." Knox grabbed a piece of paper and pencil, scrawling quickly. "Not about control, about safety. Worried sick." Emmeline read the note and her expression softened slightly, but she was not ready to back down completely. "I understand you were worried," she said more calmly, "but I need you to trust that I can take care of myself. I survived on my own for years before I met you. I am not helpless." Knox closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside him. When he opened them again, he reached for the paper and wrote more carefully this time. "I know you are strong. That is why I love you, but I love you, cannot help worry. Please just send word next time." The tension drained from Emmeline's shoulders. "That is fair," she said quietly. "I will send word next time. I should have thought of it, but I got caught up with helping Tommy with his reading and time got away from me. I am sorry I worried you." Knox pulled her into his arms, and they stood like that for a long moment, holding each other. It was not their last fight, but it established a pattern. They might struggle to communicate in the heat of the moment, but they always worked through it eventually, always came back to understanding. Winter gave way to spring, and with the warming weather came news that caused ripples of excitement through Wickenburg. The town was growing, and there was talk of building a larger school. The Territorial Education Board had allocated funds, recognizing the increasing number of families settling in the area. Emmeline was thrilled at the prospect of a real schoolhouse with multiple rooms, better supplies, and the possibility of hiring an additional teacher to help manage the growing number of students. Knox shared her excitement, but he also saw how the added responsibility was wearing on her. She was working longer hours, meeting with town officials and parents, while still teaching full days and managing the household. In April, Emmeline began experiencing bouts of exhaustion and morning nausea that initially alarmed Knox. When she finally visited the doctor, she returned home with a glow in her eyes that made Knox's heart skip. She did not even wait until she was fully through the door before announcing, "Knox, we are going to have a baby." Knox froze for a moment, processing the words, then crossed the room in 3 long strides and swept her up in his arms, spinning her around while she laughed. When he set her down, he placed both hands gently on her still flat stomach, his eyes asking permission. Emmeline covered his hands with her own. "Yes, in there, our baby, due in late October or early November." Knox felt tears prick his eyes, something that had only happened a handful of times since he was a child, and he pulled Emmeline close, overcome with a joy so profound it felt almost like pain. The pregnancy brought new challenges to their silent communication. Emmeline needed things she could not always predict, and Knox had to become even more attentive to her subtle cues. He learned to recognize when she needed water before she asked, when she was uncomfortable but trying to hide it, when she was overwhelmed and needed him to simply hold her. He read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could get his hands on, or rather, Emmeline read them aloud to him in the evenings, and he prepared their small house for the baby's arrival with the same focused determination he brought to everything he cared about. The new schoolhouse was completed in August, a fine 2-room building with real glass windows and a bell that could be heard across town. There was a small ceremony to mark the opening, and Emmeline gave a short speech thanking everyone who had contributed to making it possible. Knox stood in the back with the other ranch hands and townspeople, his chest swelling with pride as he watched his wife, his brilliant, determined wife, command the room's attention. She was showing now, her pregnancy visible in the gentle swell beneath her dress, and there was something radiant about her that went beyond her physical appearance. After the ceremony, as people mingled and celebrated, a stranger approached Knox. He was well dressed for Wickenburg, with a suit that suggested money and a confident bearing that suggested authority. "You are Knox Hawthorne, are you not?" the man asked. Knox nodded cautiously. "I am Robert Turner, representative from the territorial government. I have been hearing interesting things about your wife's teaching methods and about your particular situation." Knox felt his shoulders tense, uncertain where this was going. "I understand you lost your voice saving animals from a fire. That speaks to character, Mr. Hawthorne. The kind of character we need more of in this territory." Knox did not know how to respond to that, so he simply waited. Turner continued, "I am working on a proposal to establish a school for deaf children in Phoenix. We have a growing population who could benefit from such an institution, but we lack people with experience in non-verbal communication. I wondered if your wife might be interested in consulting on the project. We would compensate her, of course, and it would not require relocating, just occasional visits to share what she has learned about teaching without relying solely on spoken language." Knox felt a surge of pride mixed with concern. He knew Emmeline would be interested. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work she craved, but with the baby coming, was this the right time? He gestured for Turner to wait a moment, then went to find Emmeline and brought her back to hear the proposal directly. As he had predicted, her eyes lit up with interest as Turner explained. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "Could we discuss details later, perhaps after our child is born? I am very interested, but I want to make sure I can commit the time and energy it deserves." Turner agreed readily, providing his contact information and congratulating them both on the coming baby. After he left, Emmeline turned to Knox with shining eyes. "Can you believe it? They want to learn from us, from what we have built together. Our way of communicating might help other people." Knox smiled and touched her cheek gently. Of course he believed it. She had already changed his entire world. Why should she not change a broader one? Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected. Knox had been in the barn tending to a horse with colic when Silas came running, shouting that Emmeline's pains had started. Knox dropped everything and sprinted to the house, finding Emmeline gripping the edge of their kitchen table, her face pale but determined. Margaret Copper was already there. She had been visiting when the labor began, and she had sent her husband to fetch the doctor. "She needs you calm," Margaret told Knox firmly. "Can you do that?" Knox nodded, taking several deep breaths to steady himself, then went to Emmeline and took her hand. The labor lasted through the night, long and difficult in the way of first babies. Knox stayed by Emmeline's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, being whatever she needed him to be. When she screamed with pain, he did not flinch or try to quiet her. When she wept with exhaustion, he held her and let his own tears fall silently. And when the doctor finally said, "Push," Knox supported her back and let her squeeze his hand hard enough to leave bruises he would wear proudly for a week. Their son came into the world with a lusty cry that filled the small house. The doctor cleaned him and wrapped him in a blanket, then handed him to Emmeline. Knox had thought he understood love. He loved his brother. He loved his horses. He loved Emmeline with his whole heart, but looking at his son's tiny, perfect face, he discovered an entirely new dimension of the emotion. This small being was part of him and part of Emmeline, a living testament to what they had built together. When Emmeline placed the baby in Knox's arms, he held him with infinite care, this fragile new life, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in him like a physical force. They named him Nathan Henry Hawthorne, and he was perfect. Knox took a week off work to help Emmeline recover and to simply be present for these first precious days of their son's life. He learned to change diapers, to walk the floor with a fussy baby at 3 in the morning, to recognize the different meanings of Nathan's cries. And Nathan, it seemed, had inherited his mother's gift for non-verbal communication. Even as a tiny infant, he responded to Knox's expressions and gestures, calming when Knox held him, watching his father's face with dark, intelligent eyes. The early months of parenthood were exhausting but joyful. Emmeline returned to teaching after the new year, bringing Nathan with her to the schoolhouse in a basket where he napped while she taught. The older students were fascinated by the baby, and Emmeline used him as a teaching opportunity, letting them practice gentle touches and quiet voices around the infant. Knox adjusted his work schedule so he could take Nathan for part of the day, strapping the baby to his chest in a carrier Emmeline had fashioned and going about his ranch duties with his son against his heart. Knox worried sometimes about how Nathan would manage having a father who could not speak to him, could not call to him if he was in danger, could not tell him bedtime stories in the traditional way. But Emmeline was always quick to reassure him. "He will know your voice in all the ways that matter," she told Knox one evening as they watched Nathan sleep. "He will know the sound of your footsteps, the feel of your hands, the love in your eyes. That is more than enough." And she was right. As Nathan grew from infant to toddler, he developed his own language with Knox that was remarkably sophisticated. By the time he was 2, Nathan understood dozens of gestures and could interpret his father's expressions with uncanny accuracy. He could also, to Knox's amazement and delight, sign simple words himself. Emmeline had been learning sign language from books Robert Turner had sent from Phoenix, and she taught both Nathan and Knox. It opened up new channels of communication that made Knox's heart soar actual words he could share with his son, beyond just gestures and expressions. The School for Deaf Children in Phoenix opened in 1885, and Emmeline did indeed consult on the project, making several trips to the territorial capital with Knox and Nathan. Knox was initially uncomfortable in the school, surrounded by children who reminded him of his own loss, but he found unexpected comfort in seeing how effectively they communicated with each other and with their teachers. These children were not limited by their inability to hear or speak. They were vibrant, intelligent, full of life and potential. One of the teachers, a deaf woman named Sarah Chen who had been educated back east, took particular interest in Knox's story. Through an interpreter, Sarah told Knox, "You think you lost something in that fire. But maybe you gained something too. You learned to communicate in a purer way without the barrier of imperfect words. You learned to truly see and be seen. That is a gift many hearing people never discover." Knox thought about her words long after they returned to Wickenburg. Could his injury truly be seen as a gift? He would never go that far. He would always mourn the loss of his voice, the inability to call out warnings or speak his love aloud. But Sarah was right that he had gained something unexpected, a depth of connection with Emmeline that went beyond anything words could create, a bond with his son that was profound precisely because it had to be built on attention and presence rather than casual chatter. In 1886, Theodore Copper offered Knox a position as foreman of the Copper Ridge Ranch. It came with a raise in pay and a larger house on the property. "I have watched you with the men," Theodore told Knox, communicating partly through speech and partly through written notes. "They respect you. You lead by example, not by ordering people around. That is the kind of foreman I need." Knox was honored but also uncertain. How could he be foreman when he could not shout orders, could not settle disputes verbally, could not do a dozen things that seemed essential to the job? Emmeline had no such doubts. "You will be an excellent foreman," she said firmly when Knox shared his concerns. "You have always been a leader, Knox. The other men follow you because they respect you, because you work harder than anyone and never ask them to do something you would not do yourself. That will not change just because you have a title." Silas agreed, clapping Knox on the shoulder and grinning. "Take the job, brother. You have earned it 10 times over." So Knox accepted, and to his surprise and relief, Emmeline and Silas were right. The ranch hands adjusted quickly to taking orders through gestures, written notes, and sometimes through Silas or another hand who would translate Knox's directions into speech. Knox's management style was based on clear expectations, fair treatment, and leading by example. He was always the first one up in the morning and the last one to quit at night. He never asked a man to handle a dangerous horse or difficult situation without being right there beside him. Within months, the ranch was running more smoothly than it had in years, and Theodore made a point of telling everyone in town that hiring Knox as foreman was the best decision he had ever made. The larger house was a blessing, especially when Emmeline became pregnant again in late 1886. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1887, arriving much faster than Nathan had, almost as if she were impatient to get into the world. They named her Rose Marie Hawthorne, and she was as different from Nathan as night from day. Where Nathan had been a calm, observant baby, Rose was tempestuous and demanding from the start. She cried louder, wanted more attention, and made her displeasure known when things did not go her way. But she also laughed more readily, smiled bigger, and filled their house with an energy that was simultaneously exhausting and delightful. Nathan, at 4 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister. He would sit beside her basket for hours, talking to her in a mixture of spoken words and signs, telling her stories about the ranch and the horses and the wide Arizona sky. Knox watched his children together and felt a contentment so deep it was almost frightening. How had he gotten so lucky? How had a silent cowboy who thought his life was over managed to build something this beautiful, this full? Rose proved even more adept than Nathan at reading Knox's non-verbal communication. By the time she was 2, she could interpret his slightest expression, often announcing to the room, "Papa is happy," or "Papa is thinking," or "Papa says no," based solely on looking at his face. It became a game for her, trying to guess what Knox was feeling before he even fully expressed it. She was usually right. In 1889, Robert Turner visited Wickenburg again with a new proposal. The school for deaf children in Phoenix was thriving, and there was now interest in establishing similar schools throughout the territory and beyond. Would Emmeline and Knox consider writing a book about their experiences? about how they had built a life and a family despite Knox's inability to speak, about the communication methods they had developed. "Your story could help so many people," Turner said earnestly. "Both deaf families and families like yours, where one member has lost their voice. You have proven that such losses do not have to be limiting." Knox looked at Emmeline, letting her read the question in his eyes. "What do you think?" Emmeline considered for a long moment, then smiled. "I think we have a story worth telling," she said. "Yes, Mr. Turner, we will write your book." The process took 2 years, worked on in stolen hours between ranch duties and teaching and raising 2 energetic children. Emmeline did most of the actual writing, but every word was collaborative, discussed and refined until it accurately reflected both their experiences. Knox contributed detailed descriptions of his gesture language, of the emotional journey from losing his voice to finding new ways to communicate, of the challenges and unexpected gifts his injury had brought. The book, titled Silent Words, A Story of Love and Communication, was published in 1891 and became unexpectedly popular, especially in education circles and among families dealing with similar challenges. Knox was embarrassed by the attention but proud of what they had accomplished. Letters arrived from across the country and even from overseas, thanking them for showing that disability did not mean inability, that love could transcend conventional communication, that families could thrive despite challenges that seemed insurmountable. One letter in particular moved Knox to tears when Emmeline read it to him. It was from a woman in Boston whose husband had lost his voice to illness. She wrote, "Before reading your book, I thought our marriage was over. I thought we could not possibly understand each other anymore. But you showed me that I was not trying hard enough, that I was mourning what we had lost instead of discovering what we could build. Your story gave me hope. Thank you for sharing it." Knox held that letter for a long time, thinking about the fire that had stolen his voice 14 years earlier. He had thought that fire had destroyed his life. But sitting in his comfortable home, with his wife correcting student papers beside him and his children asleep in their beds down the hall, Knox understood that the fire had not destroyed his life at all. It had changed it, certainly. It had challenged him in ways he never could have imagined. But it had also led him to Emmeline, to this deep and profound connection they had built, to a family that communicated in ways that went far beyond words. Nathan graduated from Emmeline's school in 1895 at age 13 and immediately went to work on the ranch with Knox. He was a natural horseman, patient and skilled, with his father's gift for understanding animals. He also served as an informal interpreter for Knox when needed, able to convey his father's thoughts and instructions with remarkable accuracy. Rose, at 8, was already declaring her intention to be a teacher like her mother, spending hours playing school with her dolls and any ranch children she could convince to be her students. In 1897, Theodore Copper decided to retire and offered to sell the Copper Ridge Ranch to Knox at a price he could afford through a long-term payment plan. It was a tremendous opportunity, but also a tremendous risk. Owning the ranch would mean security for his family, a legacy to leave his children, but it would also mean debt and responsibility on a scale Knox had never handled before. He discussed it extensively with Emmeline, filling pages with written notes about his fears and hopes. Emmeline listened to all his concerns, then said simply, "You can do this. We can do this. Together." So Knox bought the ranch, and it became the Hawthorne Ranch, a name that felt strange and wonderful on the wooden sign Nathan helped him hang above the main gate. The first few years were challenging, with droughts and market fluctuations and the 1,000 difficulties that came with ownership. But Knox's reputation as a fair employer and skilled rancher drew good men to work for him, and the ranch not only survived but eventually thrived. Emmeline retired from teaching in 1900, deciding at 40 that she wanted to focus her energy on other pursuits. She continued her work with schools for deaf children, now traveling extensively throughout Arizona and New Mexico, consulting and training teachers. Knox often accompanied her, and they became well-known figures in education, circles the rancher who could not speak, and his wife who had learned to hear with more than her ears. Nathan married in 1902, bringing home a sweet-tempered woman named Clara who worked in the Wickenburg General Store. Knox liked her immediately, especially the way she took Nathan's habit of signing with his father completely in stride, learning the basics herself within weeks. Rose, following through on her childhood declaration, attended a teaching college in Phoenix and returned to Wickenburg in 1904 to teach at the school her mother had once run. In 1905, Knox turned 47 years old, and Emmeline threw him a surprise party at the ranch. It seemed like the entire town showed up, ranch hands past and present. Emmeline's former students, now grown with children of their own, business people and friends and neighbors who had become family over the years. Knox was completely overwhelmed, standing in the middle of his own ranch yard surrounded by people whose lives had touched his, who had adapted to his silence, and seen past it to the man beneath. Silas, now graying but still strong, raised a toast. "To my brother Knox," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Some men fill the air with noise but say nothing of value. Knox has been silent for 23 years, but he has said more through his actions than most men say in a lifetime. To Knox, a good man, a good brother, a good father, and a good friend." Everyone raised their glasses, and Knox felt Emmeline slip her hand into his. He looked down at her, this woman who had changed everything, and saw his whole life reflected in her eyes. Nathan and Clara's first child was born that fall, a boy they named Knox Henry after both grandfathers. Holding his grandson for the first time, Knox was struck by the strange, beautiful continuity of life. This child would never know the Uncle Knox had been before the fire, the man who talked easily and told jokes. But that did not matter. This child would know the grandfather Knox was now, and that was enough. More than enough. The book Knox and Emmeline had written years earlier was revised and expanded in 1907, with new chapters about raising children and running a business while navigating Knox's disability. The new edition included photographs of their family, of Knox working with horses, of Emmeline with her students, of Nathan and Rose signing with their father. The images told their own story. This was a family that thrived, that found joy despite challenges, that proved love and communication went far deeper than spoken words. Rose married in 1908. Choosing a teacher from Phoenix who had worked with deaf children and was fluent in sign language. Knox appreciated that Rose had found someone who could communicate with him easily, though he would have accepted anyone who made his daughter happy. The wedding was held at the ranch, and during the celebration, Knox danced with Rose to music he could not hear. She signed to him as they moved, "Thank you for teaching me to see what others miss. Thank you for showing me that there are many ways to speak and many ways to hear. I love you, Papa." Knox's eyes filled with tears as he signed back. "You are my joy, my bright light. I love you." By 1910, the Hawthorne Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the territory. Arizona had achieved statehood in 1912, and Knox served on several territorial and then state boards related to livestock and ranching. He was respected not despite his inability to speak but in many ways because of it. Knox Hawthorne thinks before he acts, one fellow rancher said. "He does not waste time with empty words. When he communicates something, you know he means it." It was a reputation Knox had never sought, but had earned through decades of consistent, principled action. Emmeline published her own book in 1913, a memoir of her years teaching that included extensive discussion of how education could be adapted for students with various disabilities and challenges. The book was used in teaching colleges throughout the Southwest, and Emmeline received an honorary degree from the Territorial University in recognition of her contributions to education. Knox sat in the audience with their children and grandchildren. There were 3 grandchildren now, with another on the way, and watched with immense pride as his wife received her recognition. She had always been remarkable, from the moment she stepped off that stagecoach in 1882, but watching the academic community acknowledge what he had always known filled him with a satisfaction that went bone deep. In 1915, Theodore Copper passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 73. The funeral was well attended, with Theodore being remembered as a fair employer and community pillar. Knox served as a pallbearer, one of 6 men who had worked for Theodore at various times. At the reception afterward, Margaret Copper sought out Knox and Emmeline. Now 70 herself, Margaret's hair was white, but her eyes were still sharp and bright. "I want you to know," she told them, "that Theodore considered convincing you two to meet at that dinner party one of his greatest accomplishments. He told me the week before he died that of all the things he had done in his life, helping create your family might be the most important." Emmeline hugged Margaret, and Knox took the older woman's hands in his, trying to convey without words what her husband's faith in him had meant, how it had changed the trajectory of his entire life. The years that followed were peaceful, filled with the comfortable rhythms of long marriage and accumulated life. Knox and Emmeline settled into a pattern of mornings spent working Knox on ranch business, Emmeline on her writing and correspondence, and afternoons spent together, often just sitting on their porch watching the Arizona landscape they both loved. They were in their 50s now, their bodies showing the wear of hard work and full lives, but their connection remained as strong as ever. If anything, it had deepened, refined by decades of practice into something that needed even less explanation than it had at the start. Knox sometimes wondered what his life would have been like if the fire had never happened. Would he have met Emmeline through some other path? Would they have fallen in love if he could speak? He suspected not. It was his very silence that had drawn her in, that had forced them both to develop this extraordinary intimacy. And while he still sometimes mourned what he had lost the ability to call his wife's name, to tell his children stories in the traditional way, to sing or laugh aloud or express himself with simple speech, he could not bring himself to wish away the fire. Too much good had grown from that tragedy. His entire life had grown from it. Nathan took over most of the day-to-day operations of the ranch in 1918, with Knox transitioning into a more advisory role. It was not an easy shift. Knox had always been a man who worked with his hands, who needed to be in the thick of things, but at 60, his body was beginning to insist on rest whether he wanted it or not. Emmeline, approaching 58, had already significantly reduced her travel, preferring to work from home and let younger consultants handle the far-flung schools. They had earned their rest, their children told them. They had built something lasting. Now it was time to enjoy it. Rose and her husband moved back to Wickenburg in 1920, taking over the expanded school where Emmeline had once taught. Their 2 children attended the school, and Rose implemented many of the teaching methods her mother had pioneered. Watching his daughter teach, Knox saw Emmeline as she had been all those years ago, determined, creative, refusing to accept that any child could not learn if given the right approach and enough patience. It was a legacy that would outlast both of them, and Knox took profound satisfaction in that knowledge. The ranch hosted a large family reunion in the summer of 1922 to celebrate Knox and Emmeline's 40th wedding anniversary. All their children and grandchildren gathered, along with Silas and his family, old friends from town, current and former ranch hands. Someone had brought a professional photographer, and Knox found himself standing with Emmeline for a formal portrait, surrounded by the family they had created. The photographer positioned them, then paused. "Mr. Hawthorne, could you smile?" Knox was already smiling, his face reflecting the joy that filled him, but the photographer could not see it because he was looking at his camera, not at Knox's eyes. Emmeline laughed. "He is smiling," she said. "You just have to look." That photograph became one of Knox's most treasured possessions. In it, he and Emmeline stand close together, his arm around her waist, her hand resting on his chest. Their bodies angle toward each other in the unconscious way of long married couples. But it is their faces that tell the real story. Knox's eyes are on Emmeline, and everything he feels is written there: love, gratitude, wonder that this woman chose him, that they built this life together. And Emmeline's expression as she looks back at him mirrors all of that, adding her own notes of contentment and satisfaction and deep, abiding partnership. In 1925, at age 67, Knox began experiencing pain in his chest that worried Emmeline enough to insist on a doctor's visit. The diagnosis was heart disease, not uncommon for a man his age who had worked hard his entire life. The doctor prescribed rest and medication, warning that Knox needed to truly slow down now, that his body had limits whether he wanted to acknowledge them or not. Knox was frustrated by the restrictions, but Emmeline was immovable. "You cannot take care of anyone if you do not take care of yourself first," she told him firmly. "Let Nathan run the ranch. Let yourself rest. Please, Knox, I am not ready to lose you." The plea in her voice, the fear behind her words, convinced Knox where medical advice alone might not have. He had never been able to deny Emmeline anything, and he was not about to start now. So he stepped back from ranch operations entirely, spending his days reading, working on small projects that did not require heavy labor, and simply being with Emmeline. They took walks in the early mornings when the Arizona heat was still bearable, strolling through the land they had made theirs. Sometimes they talked, or rather, Emmeline talked and Knox responded through signs and expressions. Other times they just walked in comfortable silence, hands linked, needing no words to communicate their contentment. In 1928, the town of Wickenburg decided to name its expanded school the Abbott Hawthorne School, honoring both Emmeline's contributions to education and Knox's role in demonstrating alternative forms of communication. The dedication ceremony was emotional, with former students now middle-aged speaking about how Emmeline had changed their lives, how she had seen potential in children others dismissed, how she had taught them to value actions over words. One woman, now a teacher herself, told a story about watching Knox help her mother when she was a child. He could not speak, but he communicated more kindness, more genuine care than many people who talk constantly. "He taught me that how you treat people matters more than what you say to them." Knox, now 70, sat in the front row with Emmeline's hand in his, listening to these testimonials with a mixture of embarrassment and deep satisfaction. He had never sought recognition, had only tried to live his life with integrity despite his limitations. But hearing how that life had impacted others, how the example he and Emmeline had set had rippled outward to touch people they had never even known about, that was a gift beyond measure. The final years of their lives together were quiet but rich. Knox's heart condition worsened gradually, confining him increasingly to their home, but he never lost his ability to communicate with Emmeline through their intricate language of glances and gestures. If anything, that communication became even more refined, stripped down to the barest essentials. A look could convey an entire conversation. A touch could speak volumes. They had been practicing for nearly 50 years, after all. They were fluent in each other. Nathan's children were teenagers now, and Knox delighted in watching them grow, seeing pieces of himself and Emmeline in their faces and mannerisms. Rose's children were younger, still in elementary school, attending the school that bore their grandmother's name. All of them had learned to sign from an early age, treating it as simply another language, another way to communicate with the grandfather they adored. Knox taught them other things too: patience, kindness, the value of seeing beyond surface appearances. He taught them to really look at people, to pay attention, to understand that communication happened on many levels simultaneously. In the spring of 1932, Knox caught a respiratory infection that his weakened heart could not fight off effectively. He was confined to bed, with the doctor visiting daily and Emmeline rarely leaving his side. Their children took turns sitting with them, and the grandchildren were brought in one by one to say goodbye, though nobody used that word. But Knox knew. His body was giving out, all the accumulated damage and age finally demanding their due. He was not afraid. He had lived a full life, far fuller than he had ever imagined possible during those dark days after the fire, but he was sad to leave Emmeline. She was the center of his world, the person who had saved him in ways that went far beyond the practical. How could he leave her on a warm April evening, with the windows open to let in the desert breeze? Knox's breathing became labored. Emmeline sent Nathan for the doctor, then climbed into bed beside Knox, cradling his head against her shoulder. "It is all right," she whispered. "You can rest now. You have done so much, given so much. It is all right to rest." Knox looked up at her, and even now, even with his body failing, his eyes communicated clearly. He moved his hand weakly, forming signs she had no trouble reading. "Thank you for everything. Love you." Emmeline's tears fell freely now, splashing onto Knox's face. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking. "You have been my whole heart, Knox Hawthorne. Every single day has been better because of you." Knox smiled, a small, peaceful expression, and closed his eyes. His breathing grew shallower, more irregular. Emmeline held him, stroking his hair, telling him over and over how much she loved him, how grateful she was for their life together, how he had made everything better just by being himself. Nathan arrived with the doctor, but there was nothing to be done except witness. Just before dawn, with Emmeline holding him and his children gathered around, Knox Hawthorne took one final, shallow breath and was still. The funeral was enormous, with people traveling from across Arizona and beyond to pay their respects. The church was packed, and more people stood outside, unable to fit inside. Person after person stood to share memories of Knox's kindness, his integrity, his work ethic, his love for his family, the way he had proven that a man's worth was measured in his actions, not his words. The service ended with a moment of silence, which seemed fitting. Knox had lived half his life in silence, had built an entire world without words. It was only appropriate that silence mark his passing. Emmeline lived another 10 years, remaining active in education and advocacy work despite her grief. She published one final book in 1935, a memoir of her marriage to Knox titled The Language of Love. In it, she wrote, "People often asked me if I missed hearing my husband's voice. But they misunderstood. I heard Knox's voice every single day. I heard it in the way he looked at me, in the gentle touch of his hand, in the thousand small gestures that made up our life together. He was never silent to me. He was the clearest, most honest communicator I have ever known. He taught me that words are just one small part of how we speak to each other, and often not the most important part. I was blessed beyond measure to share my life with a man who loved so completely, so truly, that words were simply unnecessary. Emmeline passed peacefully in her sleep in 1942 at age 80. By that time, the Abbott Hawthorne School had expanded to include a special program for deaf students, one of the finest in the state. Nathan and Clara were still running the Hawthorne Ranch, which had weathered the Depression and remained prosperous. Rose was a school principal in Phoenix, still implementing the teaching methods her mother had pioneered. The grandchildren were grown now, with children of their own, and every one of them had learned the sign language that had allowed their grandfather to communicate, keeping that legacy alive. Knox and Emmeline were buried side by side in the Wickenburg Cemetery, under a shared headstone that read simply, Knox and Emmeline Hawthorne. They learned to speak a language all their own. It was a modest marker for a remarkable couple, but those who knew their story understood. They had taken what should have been a tragedy, a voice lost to smoke and fire, and transformed it into something beautiful. They had proven that love did not need words, that understanding went far deeper than conversation, that two people who truly saw each other could build something lasting and profound. Their story lived on long after they were gone, taught in schools, referenced in books about communication and disability, held up as an example of how challenges could become opportunities if faced with courage and creativity. But the real legacy was simpler and more immediate than that. It lived in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who understood that listening meant more than hearing, that seeing meant more than looking, that love was expressed in actions far more than in words. The barn that had stolen Knox's voice burned to ashes that hot August night in 1882. But from those ashes had grown a life, a family, a love story that proved beyond doubt that the most important things we say to each other are often said without words at all. Knox had lost his voice, but found something far more valuable: a woman who learned to read his eyes and gestures, who understood him more deeply than words ever could have conveyed, who loved him not despite his silence, but in part because of what that silence had taught them both about real communication. That was a gift that echoed through generations, a lesson worth learning, a story worth telling. In the end, Knox Hawthorne's silence spoke louder than 1,000 voices ever could. It spoke of resilience and courage, of love that transcended conventional boundaries, of the profound truth that human connection runs far deeper than the words we use to describe it. His voice was stolen by smoke and fire, but in losing it, he found something most people spend their entire lives searching for: true understanding, perfect intimacy, and a love that needed no translation because it was written in every glance, every gesture, every moment of their life together. And that truly was everything.